The line outside the Pasadena Civic Auditorium stretched farther than anyone expected. Thousands of dreamers stood under the blazing California sun, clutching number tags, water bottles, lucky charms, and hopes so fragile they almost looked visible in the air. Some singers warmed up with vocal scales. Dancers stretched on the sidewalk. Magicians practiced card tricks in silence. Everyone wanted the same thing: a chance to stand in front of the judges of America's biggest talent show and prove they were unforgettable. But near the back of the line stood a man almost nobody noticed. He wore a faded denim jacket despite the heat and carried an old black backpack slung over one shoulder. His shoes were worn thin at the edges, and his contestant number was slightly bent where his fingers kept gripping it too tightly. He looked more like someone waiting for a bus than someone preparing to perform for millions of viewers. His name was Mateo Reyes. 32 years old, born in Cebu, Philippines. Former lounge singer on cruise ships across Asia. Part-time dishwasher in Los Angeles for nearly 4 years. And according to almost everyone who knew him, completely invisible. Mateo had arrived in America with a dream that already felt outdated the moment he landed. He believed talent alone could change a life. But Los Angeles taught him quickly that dreams were expensive. Rent came first. Food came second. Survival came before music. Every night after washing dishes at a seafood restaurant near Santa Monica, he would walk 3 miles back to his tiny apartment because he couldn't always afford the bus fare. The apartment itself was hardly bigger than a storage room. 1 mattress, 1 lamp, 1 cracked mirror beside the sink. But every single night, no matter how exhausted he was, Mateo sang. Softly at first, then louder, until neighbors sometimes knocked on the walls. Not because he sounded bad. Because hearing him sing made people stop what they were doing. There was something unnatural about his voice. It didn't just sound emotional. It felt emotional, like every note carried years of heartbreak hidden inside it. Months earlier, one of Mateo's coworkers had secretly recorded him singing while cleaning dishes after closing time. The video was shaky and dark, but the voice cut through the noise like lightning through a storm. The clip gained only a few thousand views online. But among those viewers was an assistant producer from America's Got Talent. She replayed the video 6 times. Then she sent Mateo an audition invitation. At first, he thought it was fake. Then he cried. Now, standing in line outside the theater, Mateo kept staring at the giant AGT banners hanging from the building walls. Huge smiling faces of winners from previous seasons looked down at him like impossible ghosts. He almost turned around 3 different times. What if his voice wasn't enough? What if people laughed? What if he froze on stage? But then he remembered his mother. Before she passed away in the Philippines 2 years earlier, she told him something during their final phone call. Even if the world ignores you, Anik, sing anyway. So he stayed. Hours later, production assistants guided contestants backstage through long hallways buzzing with nervous energy. Some people practiced choreography, others cried quietly in corners. Mateo sat alone holding a small silver cross in his hand. When a producer approached him with a microphone pack, she smiled politely. So Mateo, tell me your story. He hesitated. There's not much story, he said softly. There always is. Mateo looked down. I came here to make music. But life happened faster than dreams. The producer noticed his trembling hands. Nervous, he laughed, weakly. I feel like I can't breathe. Minutes later, the stage manager pointed toward the entrance tunnel. You're up. The crowd inside the theater roared for the previous act. Mateo's heart slammed against his chest. The lights beyond the curtain looked blinding. For one terrifying second, his legs refused to move. Then he heard the stage manager again. Go. Mateo stepped onto the stage. At first, the audience barely reacted. There was polite applause. Nothing more. The judges glanced down at their notes. Simon Cowell leaned back in his chair with the expression of a man already expecting disappointment. How are you? Sofia Vergara asked warmly. Mateo swallowed hard. I'm okay, he replied. You don't sound okay, Howie Mandel joked. The audience laughed gently. Mateo smiled nervously. I'm trying not to pass out. Even Simon smirked. Where are you from? Heidi Klum asked. The Philippines originally. Cebu. The audience applauded louder at that. And what do you do now? Simon asked. Mateo hesitated again. I wash dishes. There was a brief silence. Not cruel, just awkward. Simon nodded slowly. And why AGT? Mateo looked out at the audience. Because for the first time in years, he wanted to answer honestly. I think this is my last chance to become the person I promised my mother I'd be. Suddenly the room felt quieter. Simon's expression shifted slightly. Okay, he said. Good luck. Mateo walked toward the center mark taped on the stage floor. The music track began softly. A piano. Slow. Delicate. The audience settled into silence. Then Mateo sang the first note. And the entire theater changed. Gasps erupted instantly. Not after the chorus. Not after some dramatic build. Immediately. The sound coming from him didn't seem physically possible. His voice soared with a haunting clarity that felt almost supernatural. It carried power without shouting. Pain without forcing emotion. The tone was rich and smooth 1 second, then heartbreakingly fragile the next. People in the audience physically leaned forward. A woman near the front covered her mouth. Heidi's eyes widened. Howie turned toward Simon with an expression that silently screamed, "What is happening?" But Simon didn't move. He simply stared. Mateo closed his eyes as he sang the second verse. And suddenly he wasn't in Pasadena anymore. He was back in Cebu. Back in the tiny house where typhoon rain hammered the roof while his mother cooked rice over a small stove. Back to singing old love songs beside an electric fan that barely worked. Back to being a child who believed music could save people. Every memory poured into his voice. The loneliness. The homesickness. The nights he cried alone after double shifts. The humiliation of being rejected by labels. The guilt of not making it home before his mother died. All of it came out in the performance. By the time he reached the chorus, audience members were already crying. Not because the song was sad. Because his voice sounded too real. Too human. Too full of truth. Then came the note. One impossible note. The kind singers usually avoid live because failure is almost guaranteed. Mateo took a breath. And launched into it. The sound exploded through the theater like pure emotion ripped directly from the soul. The note climbed higher. And higher. And somehow higher still. The audience lost their minds. People jumped to their feet before the note even ended. Heidi slapped the table. Sophia screamed. Howie's jaw literally dropped open. And Simon Cowell, the man famous for staying emotionally guarded, blinked rapidly as if he genuinely couldn't process what he had just heard. Mateo held the note perfectly. No crack, no strain, just impossible control. When he finally released it, the theater erupted. The applause was deafening, but Mateo kept singing, and somehow the emotional intensity only grew stronger. By now, people weren't just watching a contestant. They were witnessing something unforgettable. Phones appeared across the audience as viewers tried desperately to capture the moment. Backstage crew members stopped working to watch the monitors. One producer whispered, "This is insane." Another simply said, "We found him." Then Mateo stripped everything back. The music softened, the lights dimmed, and he sang the final lines almost like a prayer. Barely above a whisper, yet somehow every single word reached the back of the theater. It felt intimate, sacred even, as if for 3 minutes, thousands of strangers had become part of one shared heartbeat. Then silence, absolute silence. For half a second nobody moved. Not because they disliked it. Because they were stunned. Then the entire room exploded into the loudest standing ovation of the day. People screamed, cried, clapped so hard their hands hurt. Mateo stood frozen at center stage trying to understand what was happening. His eyes filled with tears instantly. He looked overwhelmed, almost frightened. Simon leaned forward slowly. "Mateo." The audience quieted. "I've heard thousands and thousands of singers over the years." Simon paused. "But every once in a while, somebody walks onto this stage and reminds us why these shows matter in the first place." The crowd cheered loudly. Simon pointed toward Mateo. "That voice is not just good. It's rare. Honestly, it shouldn't even exist." The audience erupted again. Mateo covered his mouth as tears rolled down his face. Heidi spoke next. "You made me emotional from the first note. Your voice feels like a movie soundtrack mixed with pain and hope together. I don't know how to explain it." Sophia nodded passionately. "You sing like somebody who has lived 1,000 lives." Howie leaned across the table. "I think everyone watching at home is going to remember this audition for years." The crowd roared again. Mateo kept shaking his head in disbelief. Simon glanced toward the other judges. Well, I think we know where this is going. Heidi shouted first. Yes. Sophia followed. Absolutely yes. How could it be anything else? Howie laughed. Yes. Then Simon looked directly at Mateo. And from me, a massive yes. The audience exploded once more. Mateo bent forward crying as golden confetti graphics flashed across the screens behind him. But then something unexpected happened. The cheering didn't stop. Instead, it grew louder. And louder. The judges looked toward the crowd. People were chanting, "Golden buzzer! Golden buzzer!" over and over. Simon raised his eyebrows. That's interesting, he muttered. Because golden buzzers were supposed to feel obvious. Immediate. Electric. And suddenly everyone in the room realized they were feeling exactly that. Mateo stood there crying silently while the chants continued echoing through the theater. Heidi looked at Sophia. Sophia looked at Howie. Howie looked at Simon. Simon exhaled slowly. Then, without warning, he stood up. The audience screamed instantly. Mateo looked confused. Simon walked toward the center of the judges' table. You know, he said, I didn't plan on doing this today. The crowd grew louder. But some performances happen for a reason. Mateo's eyes widened. And I think yours just reminded millions of people watching that impossible things still exist. Simon slammed the golden buzzer. The theater detonated into chaos. Gold confetti rained from the ceiling. Mateo collapsed to his knees sobbing. Audience members screamed so loudly the music nearly disappeared beneath the noise. Heidi and Sophia rushed onto the stage hugging Mateo while confetti covered his shoulders and hair. Simon walked up more slowly, smiling in a way viewers almost never saw. Mateo could barely speak. Oh my God! Oh my God! The cameras captured tears streaming down his face as he looked upward into the golden storm falling around him. For one beautiful moment, every sacrifice suddenly felt worth it. Backstage afterward, producers scrambled frantically. Social media clips from the audience had already started spreading online before the episode even finished filming. One assistant stared at her phone. He's trending already. Another producer shook his head. This never happens this fast. Meanwhile, Mateo sat alone in a backstage interview room holding a bottle of water with trembling hands. He still looked dazed. A producer asked softly, "What are you feeling right now?" Mateo laughed through tears. "I think my brain stopped working." Everyone in the room laughed. Then he became emotional again. "My mother loved music more than anyone I knew. She always believed I had a gift. Even when nobody else did." His voice cracked. "I just wish she saw this." The room fell silent. Even the camera operators looked emotional. That night, after filming ended, Mateo walked outside the theater alone. The California air felt colder now. Quieter. His phone buzzed non-stop in his pocket. Missed calls. Messages. Notifications exploding every second. Clips of his performance were spreading across TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook faster than anyone could track. People posted reactions with captions like, "This voice can't be real. I have chills. Best AGT audition in years. Who is this guy?" One video reached 2 million views before sunrise. Another reached 5 million by lunchtime. Major music pages reposted the performance. Celebrity singers reacted online. Even people who normally ignored talent shows started sharing the clip. Because Mateo's audition didn't feel manufactured. It felt genuine. And in a world full of polished performances and viral gimmicks, genuine emotion hit harder than ever. The next morning Mateo went back to the seafood restaurant for his scheduled shift. He almost didn't, but he needed the money. When he entered through the kitchen doors, every employee suddenly stopped working. Then the entire kitchen burst into applause. Mateo stared in shock. One cook shouted, "Hollywood star." Another yelled, "Don't forget us when you're famous." Mateo laughed harder than he had in years. His manager approached him smiling. "You know half our customers came today because of you." Mateo blinked. "What?" "They saw the clips online. Everybody's talking about you." Mateo looked completely overwhelmed. But the strangest moment came later that afternoon. An elderly Filipino woman entered the restaurant carrying her phone. She walked directly toward Mateo. "You were the singer," she whispered. Mateo nodded shyly. The woman's eyes filled with tears. "When you sang last night, It reminded me of home. Mateo felt his throat tighten. The woman reached for his hand. Thank you for making us proud. For a second he couldn't answer. Because all his life, success felt distant, abstract, like a door permanently locked. But now something had changed. Not just for him, for people watching, for immigrants, for dreamers, for every exhausted person secretly wondering if their best years already passed. Weeks later, when the audition finally aired on television, the reaction became even bigger. Viewers uploaded reaction videos of themselves crying. Music experts analyzed his vocal control online. Fans demanded full recordings. News outlets called the performance one of the greatest AGT auditions ever. Even Simon Cowell mentioned it repeatedly during interviews. There was something very authentic about him, Simon said during one appearance. You can't fake that level of emotion. Mateo's social media followers exploded from a few hundred to millions. Record labels contacted him. Producers offered collaborations. Concert invitations flooded his inbox. Yet despite everything changing overnight, Mateo stayed strangely grounded. Because deep down, he still felt like the same dishwasher from Santa Monica. The same lonely man singing to himself after midnight. Except now, the world was finally listening. During the AGT Live semifinals, Mateo delivered another breathtaking performance. But this time something felt different. He wasn't singing from desperation anymore. He was singing from belief. And that confidence transformed him. His voice became even stronger. More fearless. By the final note, the entire audience stood again. Not out of obligation, out of awe. Simon smiled before the applause even ended. You know what's incredible, he said afterward. You came into this competition invisible. Now you walk on stage like a superstar. Mateo shook his head. No, he replied softly. I walk on stage like someone who finally stopped being afraid. The audience erupted, and somewhere across the world, millions of viewers felt that line deep inside themselves. Because Mateo's journey was never just about singing. It was about being seen. Really seen. Not for status, not for money, but for the raw truth inside him. Months later, after AGT ended, Mateo returned briefly to the Philippines. The airport arrival looked like something out of a movie. Crowds filled the terminal waving signs and flags. People screamed his name. Children sang parts of his audition song while recording videos. Mateo looked stunned as he walked through the crowd. Reporters pushed microphones toward him. How does it feel to become a global sensation? One asked. Mateo smiled softly. I still don't understand it honestly. Then his expression grew emotional. But I hope people remember this. The cameras moved closer. You don't have to come from money or fame or perfect circumstances to change your life. Sometimes all you need is one moment where you stop hiding who you are. That quote spread everywhere online. And for millions of people, Mateo Reyes became more than a singer. He became proof. Proof that talent can still break through noise. Proof that authenticity still matters. Proof that impossible dreams sometimes survive longer than fear. Late one evening during his first international tour, Mateo stood alone backstage before another sold-out concert. The arena outside thundered with thousands of screaming fans waiting for him to appear. Yet for a moment, he closed his eyes and remembered the tiny apartment in Los Angeles. The cracked mirror, the long walks home, the nights he nearly gave up. Then he smiled, because somewhere out there, another invisible dreamer was probably watching. Another exhausted worker secretly holding on to impossible hope. Another person wondering if their voice mattered. And maybe, just maybe, they would hear his story and decide not to quit. The stage manager tapped his shoulder. Ready. Mateo opened his eyes. The crowd roared louder beyond the curtain. This time, he didn't feel afraid. He took one deep breath and stepped into the light.